Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're joining us from. I'm Sarah Green Carmichael, Senior Associate Editor at HBR, and I want to thank all of you for joining us today from wherever you're calling in from. We really want this to be an interactive webinar, so if you have questions or comments at any time, just type your question in the chat box on the lower left corner of your screen. To download a copy of today's presentation, click on the resources icon also in the lower left corner of the screen, and if you at any time need help during the presentation, click on the help icon. That's in the lower right corner of your screen. We also have a conversation going on at Twitter. You can find us at HBR Exchange and use the hashtag HBRWebinar. Now, on to our topic for today. Managers often feel that meetings and conversations with employees don't yield the results that they want. I think we've all been there. Seemingly good conversations from these meetings are not followed up by actions and results, and as a result of all this, not enough progress is made in all the work that we need to be doing. Here to help us with this today is Paul Axtell, meeting productivity expert and an author. He says the lack of tangible outcomes from meetings can be traced back to managers lacking one vital skill, the ability to deliberately close a conversation. So he's here today to describe the 5 essential tasks for improving meetings results and ending meetings the right way. He provides consulting, coaching, and conversational skills training to a wide variety of clients from Fortune 500 companies and universities to nonprofits and government agencies. His book is Meetings Matter, 8 Powerful Strategies for Remarkable Conversations, and he's director of Contextual Program Designs, his consulting firm. Paul, thank you so much for talking with us today, and with that, I will turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Sarah. It's a pleasure to be here. Welcome to everybody. I sincerely appreciate that you're dialed in and joining us in the conversation. Let me say just a couple other things about myself, give you a little bit of background. I'm a chemical engineer from South Dakota School of Mines and Technology. I have an MBA from Washington University in St. Louis. And as Sarah said, I'm basically a corporate and university trainer. Worked in manufacturing, engineering, and personnel for 25 years. Started my own company about 15 years ago. I'm married to Cindy, and we have 5 children and 13 grandchildren. I love golf, fly fishing, and mysteries. I think personality-wise, you'll find I'm pretty relaxed about life, but yet I'm driven. If I look at the work I do, I'm basically operating with one general premise, that it's possible to be 5 times more productive, work less hours, and be less stressed. And part of the answer lies in mastering our ability to converse in both relationships and in groups. I'd like to give you a bit more room on taking notes. You have the slides, and I'm also willing to give you my speaking notes. If you'd like me to do that, just send me an email. I'll put that up at the end of the program. Because if you'd like to use these slides and my notes to work with your group, you're more than welcome to do that. Okay, let's get to it. The session is named The Right Way to End a Meeting, because if I needed to pick a single idea to improve your meetings, I would pick closure. But before we discuss closure, I want to cover a couple of ideas first. Preparation and conversation. These are the 2 ideas that are at the heart of being effective: perspective and conversation. So let's start with perspective. Our perspective shapes how we think and react to any set of circumstances. Effective people notice when they're not relating to something powerfully, and they find a new perspective. These are 2 of my favorite quotes. They're both perspective quotes. The first is by Adam Wainwright, Cardinal baseball pitcher. He said, "If you are willing to be mediocre, then you'll be mediocre." I think that's pretty powerful. If you're willing to be mediocre, you'll be mediocre. The second comes from the cartoonist Al Capp. "Nothing is so ordinary as a desire to be extraordinary." So that's the way human beings are wired. Even though we know we're ordinary, we desire to be extraordinary. Psychologist William James says, "One of the beauties about being a human being is you have the ability to change your mind. You can change your perspective." One of the most powerful perspectives is captured in a single phrase. It's possible to be remarkable. So let me tell you a story about being remarkable, both as a perspective and in terms of taking action. You may have noticed the church in the background on the slide. It reminds me of a story about Ken. Cindy and I had an opportunity to go to Tanzania, and we were on this photographic safari. You would say it's a wonderful place. You should go. And with us was a veterinarian named Ken from Canada. And on coffee, Ken asked me what I did, and along the way I mentioned about I'm very interested in the possibility of being remarkable. He says, well, I've got this great story for you about being remarkable. I said, wonderful. I said, tell me. He said, well, I've had this long client, a wonderful woman, and she called me up and asked me if I'd come down and put her pony to sleep. So her favorite pony was ill, and so she called me up and asked me if I would put her pony to sleep. So I went out to the ranch, and we walked out into the fields, and we spent some time with her pony, and then she says, okay, I need to leave while you put my pony to sleep. And Ken, would you do one more thing for me? Would you put the pony in the ground for me? I said, sure, even though I had no idea how I was going to do this. So she left. I put the pony to sleep, and then I was standing out there, and I looked across the vista, and there's a church. And I thought, well, small church, they have graveyards. Maybe I can get some help there. So I drove over. There was a gentleman out working around the church. In the back was a small backhoe. So I walked up to him, and I said, I hope you don't mind, but I've got an unusual request. And I explained to him about my client, her pony. I said, would you help me? And his response was wonderful. He said, I'd be honored. About 90 minutes later, we're out in the field, standing next to this hole that he had dug with his backhoe. And I said, that's good. That's deep enough. And he turned to me and says, Ken, you know your job. I know mine. This hole is not ready yet. And he took another 20 minutes. He made sure every wall was perfectly vertical. There was no loose dirt in the bottom. And then he turned to me and says, okay, Ken, the hole's not ready for your pony. So that's a wonderful story because being remarkable is both a perspective and it's a set of actions consistent with being remarkable. If we don't walk into meetings with an empowering mindset, many of the strategies will not have an impact. And I think we've simply settled for less in terms of how we think about meetings. Recently, I was on a plane from Minneapolis to Phoenix. Sitting next to me, a young man. I have the draft of the meetings book out. I'm working on it. He asked me about it. And as soon as I mentioned I was talking about meetings, he says, oh, I'm going to Phoenix for 2 days of meetings, and I hope I can stay awake. And I thought, wow, maybe he'd be interested in learning about meetings. He wasn't. So even though he was going to Phoenix for 2 days, he was dreading going. He had no interest in getting better. He simply has settled for less. If we don't walk into meetings with an empowering mindset, many of the strategies and techniques won't have an impact. Here are 4 perspectives I think are most useful with respect to you and I in meetings. Number 1, meetings are a competitive advantage for any organization that masters them. Number 2, if you call a meeting, you are responsible for the time and talent in the room. Treat that with respect. 3, as a participant, choose to own every meeting into which you attend. I know it's not your meeting from an accountability point of view, but if you choose to own that meeting, you will see different things, you will have different reactions, and you will participate differently. And the 4th perspective I think that will make a large difference is that mastering process skills associated with conducting meetings will set you apart in most organizations. So those are the perspectives that I would encourage you to take away. Let's go on to this idea of conversation. I love this quote by Deborah Tannen. Each person's life is lived as a series of conversations. I love it because it leads us to 2 other possible ideas. First, a relationship can be looked at as a series of conversations. And second, a meeting is just a series of conversations. So life is a series, a relationship is a series, a meeting is a series. Which then means if we change the conversation, if we enhance the conversation, we can alter our experience of life, we can alter our relationships, and we can alter our meetings. Let's stay a little bit with this idea about conversation matters In addition to our work on meetings today, I'd be thrilled if you leave with a new appreciation for conversation. Susan Scott, the author of Fierce Conversation, said it very powerfully. While no single conversation is guaranteed to change the trajectory of a career, a business, a marriage, or a life, any single conversation can. So she's saying conversation matters. There's an old adage, if you want to change your kids, change their playground and their friends. I saw some recent research that said who your kids play with have as much impact about how your kids turn out as you do. That's a scary thought. It simply means what are the conversations in which your kids are growing up. Another piece of this notion that conversation matters is that language creates, particularly if you're in a leadership position, you want to be looking at what are you creating when you speak. Cindy and I were at a baseball game, and right in front of us sat maybe a 5-6 year old girl, a brother who was maybe a year older, and their father. And the little girl had a baseball hat on and a baseball glove, and she was intent on catching a foul ball. So every time the ball would go up in the air, she would jump up and say, "Get it for me, Daddy, get it for me." In the beginning, the ball could be hit into right field when we were on the third base side. She would jump up anyway. But over time, she started to figure out when the ball was close and when it wasn't. And she would jump up every time, "Get it for me, Daddy." About the fourth inning, she turned to her father and said, "Daddy, can girls play in the major leagues?" "Nope, they're not allowed." And there was this long pause. And then you know this little girl's going to be fine because she came back with a whole lot of attitude, and she says, "Why not?" But then her brother said, "Because if they get hit with a ball, they'll cry." And the conversation ended. Now, there's two potentially harmful conversations there. Nope, they're not allowed, and they'll cry if they get hit with a ball. The point being, I don't think the father noticed those conversations occurred. There's lots of ways he could have responded. "Well, if you're good enough, you can play." Or, "Would you like to play?" Small data point, conversation matters, and you always want to be thoughtful about what you produce when you speak. If you're interested in leadership, maybe leadership isn't a gene you've got inside of you. Maybe it's a conversational phenomenon. Maybe leaders simply speak and listen differently from most people. Last piece, it's a core competency, I think, for individuals who want to make a difference in an organization. After mastering your discipline, whether it be engineering, IT, or music, your ability to influence, add value, and get noticed is determined by your ability to convene small groups of people and manage the conversation so that progress is made. Being passionate, driven, and knowledgeable will not set you apart. Managing conversations will. So let's get on to meetings more directly. A meeting is a series of conversations. So on this slide, I was trying to depict a typical meeting, 5 different topics, with then a set of steps below each topic that would show how this conversation would occur. I remember planning for a strategic planning day, a retreat with a bunch of nonprofits. Then I was worried a bit about what to do and how to do it. And I went and talked with my boss, and he says, "Paul, design is just not that mysterious. What does this group need to talk about? What are the things that are important that they talk about? What topics require the wisdom and the thinking of the group? And then what's the best way to have each conversation?" Seems pretty simple, but it's really that straightforward. What does this group need to talk about? What's going on in the organization we must talk about? What are the imperatives we've got to discuss? And then what's the best way to discuss each of those topics? If you look at the design of conversation, there's 3 basic elements: setup, process, closure. The introduction of the conversation, the conducting of the conversation, and then the wrapping up of the conversation. I like to think of setup and closure as the bookends for the conversation. Setup sets the stage. It reminds people why this topic is on the agenda. what we're trying to achieve in this conversation. Process refers to the path that we're going to take to conduct the conversation. And most conversations, especially complex conversations, benefit from a path. Closure, then, is where you deliberately ensure that the group is aligned, committed to action, and ready to leave the conversation. So let's take these three pieces one at a time. So setup elements. So this is what the person who asked the topic to be on the agenda, this is how they introduce the topic. They give you the background, give you the context for the conversation, tell you where they'd like to be at the end of the conversation, whether that's 20 minutes or 40 minutes, and what they're looking for from the group. So instead of starting a conversation with, okay, let's talk about this, I would suggest you be much more deliberate. Take a few more minutes. Explain why you want to have the conversation, where you'd like to get to, and what you're looking for. Slow down. Take your time. A few more minutes on setup will get your group to a more powerful starting point. Process steps. So this is the path. This is the set of conversations or questions we're going to work through to get through this particular topic. After 30 years of designing and leading management retreats, I went back and reviewed each of them for the processes that I used to work through all the various topics. 6 designs account for almost every conversation. For example, just to give you a sense of what I mean by meeting design, here's one of the 6 processes. This is the one for alignment. So this is a pretty extensive list. It might vary depending on your audience and the group. But basically, if you walk through these steps one at a time, you'll get to where you want to get to. If we just say a couple of things about alignment, because it's an important piece in conversational work. Most people prefer to be aligned, and in fact, not only aligned, but excited, engaged about where the organization wants to go. That's people's preference. And if they're not aligned, there's a good reason. Maybe they're not clear about what's being proposed. Maybe they don't see the value in doing it. Maybe there's something in their way, like they're already so busy they can't handle one more good project. Maybe there's something missing, and if you could provide that, they would align. If you can provide a safe, patient environment where people can reflect on what's being proposed and then tell you exactly where they are, most people will tell you what they need to have addressed in order to align. Sure, the old adage applies that people rarely destroy that which they had a part in creating, but most of the time we need people to align with the direction that was set by the organization. And that takes conversation. That takes good meeting skills. One last point about the process. The more complex the topic, the larger the group, the more emotional the topic, the clearer the process needs to be.
Paul, can I just jump in and ask you a
Sure.
question about that? Thank you. I'm wondering, how clear do you recommend people be about these sort of stage directions? Should you just say, like, this is the part of the meeting where I will talk about the process for the meeting? Or, is that kind of oddly formal? How do you recommend the leader be sort of clear or move through this without maybe giving that much explicit direction? What do you think?
If we talk about a group of 20 or 25, I need to think the path needs to be visible as well as clear. So I would add it to the agenda, or I'd put it up on a chart. One of the reasons why meetings get off track is we're not clear that there is a track. And in terms of time spent in meetings, if you stayed on track, 15, 20% of the time would be saved. So particularly with complex conversations in large groups. So you might use 3 or 4 of the questions. I mean, if you looked this side and said, okay, here's what I want to do. What questions for clarity and understanding do you have? Is there anything in your way of aligning? Is there anything missing? You could reduce it to 3 questions. Group of 5, you probably don't need to do it. You could just sit down and say, let's talk this through until we all are aligned. Same way with 1-on-1, you wouldn't need visible process. Groups of 20 or 25, I think you need visible process.
Thanks. That's really helpful.
Yeah. And I think there's a basic point here is that you and I go to coffee one-on-one. We don't need to think much about meeting design. We just simply kind of know what we'd like to get accomplished by having coffee together. A group of 5 who really know each other, they don't have to worry much about process. A group of 20, process is really important, and somebody who can manage the conversation so that it flows is pretty important. So much of what we're talking about here applies to the larger groups. If you think about what we're faced with, we all can be good in groups of 5, but many of our teams are 20, and some of them are virtual. And so the requirements behind thoughtful design and thoughtful leading go way, way up as group size increases, virtuality increases. So great question. I'm saying visible process would make a difference because then people can self-correct. They kind of know where we are in the process and what's required in terms of input next. So this is why we're talking today. Let's talk about closure, the 5 steps to wrapping up conversation. When I work with managers, this is the process piece that we always work on first. I've just got this thought that if we focus on the end of a conversation, being thorough as we wrap it up, over time, all the conversations will get better. Senior managers often complain that they have the same conversation with a person or with a group over and over and over, and nothing seems to happen. This is the correction for that. If you're deliberate in closing or wrapping up a conversation, every conversation over time will improve, and you'll stop having the same conversations over and over. There are 5 pieces to closure, and not that each piece would be covered in each conversation, but they're there if you need them. It's the complete structure, and you might not need to use the whole complete structure. I chose the image of check boxes because, in a sense, you're checking for each of these. You're checking for completion, checking for alignment, checking for commitment, checking for value, and then checking for acknowledgement. So let's go through these one at a time. Checking for completion. You're simply inviting anybody who hasn't spoken or people who have something else they would like to say or ask a chance to say it. So you're committed to not moving on to the next topic unless people are ready to move on. Said simply, does anybody have anything else you need to say or ask about this? Now, the operative word there probably is need, because bright people always have one more thing to say. But you're checking for completion. You don't want people to leave disappointed that they didn't have a chance to say something. You also don't want them thinking about something or stuck with an issue, because if they do, they'll either not be aligned or they'll bring you back to this conversation later. So checking for completion. And I encourage you just to simply ask this question, has anybody got anything else? And then wait a second, and then move on. Checking for alignment. So we talked about alignment thoroughly before when we're talking about a major decision, something that's significant, something that you want people to be behind completely. This would be more of an informal check for most conversations, so it sounds like, is everybody okay with this? Are we okay with where we ended up? So it's pretty informal, and yet you want to check, just in case somebody has something. Most teams or powerful groups have an agreement that is, if someone is not aligned, they must say before the topic moves on. So check for alignment. Check for next steps. Not all conversations end up commitments, but most should. And if there was a single thing that's missing in most organizations, it's this step right here. We simply don't stay in a conversation long enough to nail down who's going to do what by when. So thing X by time Y. Without a specific commitment in time, you can't really expect anything to get done after the meeting. One of the most consistent complaints that people have about the groups they're part of is nothing seems to move to action. or when they come back to the next meeting, things aren't done. So this is a very important step. It's sometimes tough to get into the culture because it looks like micromanaging, but it's just good project management. Sarah, you'll be pleased to know the best article I've ever seen on this was in Harvard Business Review, April 2007. It's called Promise-Based Management. It's a very powerful article about the use of language specifically related to commitment. So Harvard Business Review, April 2007, Promise-Based Management.
That's great. Thank you for the shout-out.
Oh, you're welcome. The next step is expressing value. And I'm going to slow down here a bit because I've rarely experienced this conversation in life, and I expect most people haven't. So it's missing, and it's a wonderful way to honor both the conversation and the people involved in the conversation. So 2 quick stories. I have a friend named Will Evans at Oregon State University. Wonderful guy. And if you go to coffee with Will, at the end of coffee, he's going to say, Paul, thank you for spending some time with me. Here's a couple things I'm taking away from our conversation. It just blows your mind. And if you're in a meeting with Will, at the end of every topic, he's going to ask a couple people to say what value they're taking away from the conversation. Cindy and I were working in Europe at a small factory, and we had a client named Aaron who was in charge of a large part of Europe, happened to be there, heard we were there, asked if he could drop by and sit in on some of the work we were doing in the factory. I, of course, said sure, and then the factory found out that Aaron was going to be there, and they asked if they could allow some time for 4 or 5 of the young people to present to Aaron. And I said, sure. I said, that sounds good. So the next morning, after the first day of training, Aaron comes in, and 5 or 6 people are set to do presentations, and the first one was Bruce. And Bruce got up and spoke for about 15 minutes. At the end, Aaron said, thank you, Bruce, that was good. I said, Aaron, how about value? And Aaron, who's very coachable and really brilliant, he says, thank you. Bruce, come back a moment. Bruce, I've got 5 things to tell you I'm taking away from your presentation. And then Aaron went through them one at a time. I wasn't aware of this. I appreciate knowing that. You know, that's a practice I think some other factories would like to know about. I'm going to share that with some other factories. You know, I'm going to look into that question you posed. I don't know what will come of it, but I'm going to look into it, and I'll get back to you. Now, you can imagine the typical response when somebody presents is, good, that was fine, thank you. But what's the impact on Bruce of good, fine, thank you, versus here's the 5 things I'm taking away from your presentation, Bruce? And this is the reason why, particularly in large groups, I would prefer that the leader of the group, a provost, a dean, not lead their own meetings, because I would prefer they are listening intently for the value in every conversation, such that if appropriate, at the end they can step in and say, here's what I'm taking away from the conversation. So I would encourage people to practice that. Next piece of closure, final piece of closure, acknowledge and appreciate. Is there anybody whose name came up or whose group we talked about that we should just send a note to or call them up and say thank you? We've got lots of work to do in organizations in letting people know we value them and their efforts. Taking a moment at the end of most conversations will surface an opportunity to add a bit of appreciation into the organization. So those are the 5 elements of closure, a powerful way to end a meeting. And I recommend for the next 2 weeks you simply devote a little bit more time at the end of each topic and wrap it up a little more thoughtfully. Or simply go in and watch conversations and watch the transition between conversations and see if any of these are missing. If you notice one of them is missing, you can step in and put it in. Now the next piece is also critical. It's one thing to have really powerful meetings and make progress in the meetings, but if you don't make progress between meetings the whole sense of group, the whole sense of the project team starts to erode. So it's not enough to have good meetings. You've got to have dramatic production between meetings. Two things are critical to making that happen. Somebody once asked me what I would track between meetings. And I imagine a lot of people in our audience today have these Fitbit bracelets on. And if you think about it, those are tracking and measuring devices. And one of the things that makes things happen in life is tracking and measuring something that's related to performance. What I would track and measure between meetings is what percentage of the action items agreed upon in the meeting get accomplished. So if we have very specific X by Y, I would keep track of those and then find out which of those got done. The target is 85%. If you have a group and you complete 85% of the action items between meetings, you'll be really, really good. And people have a sense that this group actually is not only productive, but remarkable. If we go back, something else that most people, I'm not sure if it's a burden or why, but we've just stopped writing good, powerful summary meetings notes. And here's the thinking. Conversation has a short half-life. It lasts about 40 minutes. It disappears. So you can have a powerful meeting, lots of great conversation, and then it's at risk. It's at risk unless it's captured in powerful, well-written notes. I always liked control over the notes from any meeting that I was a part of because I had a big say in how this meeting lives on. Because there are people who are not present. There are people who simply won't remember. Everybody's busy. And so if there's some way to write a summary so that the meeting and the key ideas in the meeting and the work of the meeting continues to exist for people, I think that's really important. Those of you who are listening in who have a knack for writing, love to write, I would encourage you to volunteer to write the notes. Let's change it from a burden to something that makes work happen between meetings. Second piece with respect to what's critical is follow up on those commitments. There's something else that came from Harvard Business Review 2005. Forget the title, something about turning strategy into performance. The article said the number one reason 63% of teams don't achieve their objectives is a lack of follow-through. Here's my thinking. People are extraordinarily busy. Great, committed people don't keep their word. So persistent follow-up is required. In fact, persistent follow-up is a source of influence. But we tend not to go there because we want to trust people. We want people to be self-starters. We think we've hired leadership potential. We don't want to be accused of micromanaging, not trusting, so we don't follow up. Let me tell you a story. I have another friend and client. His name is Paul, too. He's a university president. And Paul called me up and said, we need to have coffee. And so I went over. We were having coffee. He said, would you come in and do some leadership training for me? And I said, well, Paul, talk to me. What makes you think we need leadership training? He says, well, 2 years ago, I wanted to restart a school of journalism. I love journalism. I thought the university would benefit. 20 years ago, we cut the department for budget. I want it back. So 2 years ago, I got faculty, alumni, other people who were interested in the room, and I said, I want a journalism school. Let's start it back up. And we had this great conversation. People were excited. They could see the possibility. And now 2 years later, I don't have one because there wasn't any leadership in that room. I said, Paul, well, that's one perspective. Let me offer a different perspective. You don't have a journalism school because you didn't follow up. You didn't meet with that group 2 weeks later and say, okay, tell me what you've done and what do you need? And you didn't meet 2 weeks later and say, okay, tell me what progress you've made and what help you need. if you had met every 2 weeks, you would have a journalism school. Sure, it's wonderful if somehow somebody in the group stands up and says, let's make this happen, and they charge off. But that's not going to happen as many times as you think it will. The only guarantee you've got to have things turn out is follow up, and follow up. So that notion of 63% of the teams don't achieve their objectives, lack of follow-through, I would take that to heart. I've got one more piece. I want to step back to the whole generic thought of conversation and look at conversation in terms of being effective. I think effective conversation has these 4 attributes: clarity, candor, commitment, and completion. And you'll notice there's an overlap there. Commitment we talked about before, completion we talked about before. But this applies to every conversation, not just in meetings. Clarity, candor, commitment, and completion. When a conversation's really good, these 4 are present. They also tend to be missing. And there's some general reasons that impacts all of them. So let me go through the 4 reasons why each of these tend to be missing. Same reasons impact all of them. Group size. If your group is 5, all these get handled. If you have a group of 20, you're at risk. If you have a group of 40, you're certainly at risk. There's simply not enough time for everybody to speak. There's not enough time for the clarity conversation that you need. In large groups, some people are not going to speak. Some people are not going to be candid. Second reason why many of these are missing: the quality of the relationship walking into any meeting determines the quality of conversation. So if you want a powerful group, the answer lies in getting to know each other in a profound way. More profound than working beside each other is going to produce. You've got to somehow find out how to get to know each other at a level such that you get clarity and candor. So the quality of the relationship that walks into any meeting determines the quality of the speaking. And you can also see now why virtual groups have an uphill battle to climb, because they don't get to be together very often. Third reason why each of these 4 are impacted is we're human beings. And human beings are wired up to choose comfort. Choose comfort over speaking up. Choose comfort versus asking questions. A Fortune 100 CEO said something that I thought was wonderful. So here's somebody who's really polished, really accomplished. And what he said was, I find it easier to be myself in small groups of 4 or 5 people. So here's somebody who's really good, and they're willing to be vulnerable, saying, you know what, I just got to admit, I'm more likely to be myself in small groups. Why? I'm more likely to know everybody in a small group. Why? There's less chance I'm going to be misinterpreted. There's enough time for everybody to go back and forth. And if there's 4 or 5 of us, we're sitting close enough that I can pick up all the nonverbal clues about whether people are responding, reacting, getting defensive, embracing what I'm saying. So think about that. If a CEO is better in groups of 4 or 5, then you and I probably are too.
Paul, can I just ask a quick question about that? We had a lovely question from one of our participants to this effect. It seems like there's so many people who would like to be invited to the meeting, either because they sort of want to know what's going on, they want to feel important, they want to show their presence, show their face, whether virtual or face-to-face. And how do you manage to keep the group as small as possible so that you can actually get the work done when there are some people who really just want to be invited, whether those people are, relevant to the task at hand or not?
Well, that's a tough question. A number of things to say about that. I think you start with what's the core group of people we need to accomplish the work on the agenda. And then you say, who else would truly benefit by being invited? Maybe because their group will be impacted. Maybe because they're new to the organization and they will start to give them some background. But the watch out is that if you have 20 or 25, you will do less work and you will not put the tough topics on the agenda. And what you'll end up doing is setting up a small kitchen cabinet of 4 or 5 people that meets to do the real work. Now, I still think it's possible to be really, really good in a group of 20, 25. In fact, I have one client who has a group of 60, and when you're with that group of 60, it's like 4 or 5 people in the room but they have agreements. Nobody brings any distraction. Nobody brings in other work. The topics are well thought out. Every topic is designed. So they keep working on it and working on it. At some point, though, I think we have to be honest with people and say, do we want to trade the quality of the meeting for somebody wanting to be there? Now, I do think, let's say you push for smaller meetings. I do think you ask the question, who needs to be conversed with after the meeting so they are included, so they're informed, so they're consulted. So I guess my answer is A, you can pull it off if you have better skills and more thoughtful design. And if you are forced to choose, I would choose smaller and then think about how do you include and inform and consult the people who you leave out.
Great, thank you.
So just a couple words about each of these. Clarity generally means you need a back-and-forth conversation. One of the other watch-outs, if there's higher-level people in the room, people tend not to push back. They tend not to ask questions for clarity. So often you'll see a conversation after the meeting. Well, what do you think Bill meant by? Or what were they insinuating when they said that? And that simply means people left without clarity. Candor, I chose this image, number one, because I think people should take somebody to coffee every day. Coffee is a wonderful place to have conversation. Something about the environment, something about the invitation. And there's always somebody that you could go to coffee with to build network or talk about a difficult issue. So I like the notion of going to coffee. Conversation over coffee is different. Now, I know it's hard to have coffee over with 20 people, but I want the idea here that that's the quality of conversation you want in terms of being self-expressed, being candid, going back and forth. So candor doesn't mean that you're blunt, doesn't mean you're not civil, but it simply means you are willing to say what you think about the topic at hand. For me, to be powerful in a group as a participant, for me it means to always be self-expressed, to have nothing left unsaid that would add value to the conversation. Commitment we've talked about before. Again, pinning people down to X by Y is important. It's just what works. There's one phrase added there called or call. So in the best of all worlds, not only do you promise to do thing X by time Y, you always promise to call if it gets in jeopardy. It's not an easy backdoor. You don't intend not to keep your word, but life happens once in a while. But I know if you said you'll do this for me and I don't hear from you, it means you did it because you have promised to do X by Y, and you've also promised to call me if it comes at risk. This is not a matter of trusting. This is not a matter of micromanaging. This is just good, solid project management. And then completion. Again, completion simply means we slow down, make sure everybody's not leaving with something they haven't said, and they're ready to move on. So it tends to be missing because we run late. People got to get someplace else. In fact, that's one last piece here, and then I'll turn it back to you, Sarah. One reason that meetings aren't working is that we're booking them back to back to back to back. So not only does it set up people being late, if people know they're at risk of being late, they don't ask questions. They don't offer up ideas. So kind of the design of too many meetings laid up end to end forces us to be less clear, less committed, and less candor. So that's it. What do you see, Sarah?
That's great. You were speaking my language there on the back-to-back meetings. That was a very good point. So we have had a number of really excellent questions. One of the themes I've seen has to do with sort of the amount certain people talk and the amount certain people listen. I think I've seen questions on both. Either some people don't talk enough or other people don't listen enough. How can you, as the meeting leader, facilitator, make sure that you're hearing the right amount from everybody and that the message is actually sinking in?
Wonderful question. So as a leader of a meeting, your first two responsibilities are, one, accomplish the agenda, and number two, ensure that you get broad participation. If we look at I want to honor conversational styles. I want to honor the people that are quiet and reflective, and I want to honor the people that are easy to get into the conversation. I love people who get into conversation easily. Why? Because it's easy to get a conversation going. I think you do have to hold people back, and it's pretty simple. Say, okay, Sarah, if you don't mind, I got a couple other people here I'd like to get into the conversation, then let me get back to you. I believe on setting people up, Sarah, Allie, Margaret, so that people kind of know that you're paying attention and you're going to get to everybody. I think if somebody you can kind of predict is going to speak more often than they should, you should take them to coffee and say, look, I need your help. I'd like to get more people in the conversation. And part of my way of doing it is I need you to back off a little bit. I need you to be in less often. I'd actually like you to come in later into the conversation because I appreciate a lot of what you say. So would you do that for me? Now, I think once in a while you're going to run into somebody who people no longer listen to because they talk too long. Human beings hate to be dominated, and we hate to be dominated by somebody who speaks too often. You should take them to coffee, too, and say, look, I don't know exactly how to say this, but I'm committed to you, and you need to get that you're wearing out your welcome. People are not listening to you anymore, and in fact, they're actually doing other things when you're speaking. So, I don't want you to stop participating, but I want you to get really focused in your speaking. And focused speaking has three elements: clear, concise, and relevant. And I want you to start to train yourself that when you speak, be clear, concise, and relevant. Now, on the introverted side, I think the perspective people need to get, they're the only person with their perspective. They're the only person with their passion, their commitment, their questions. And if they don't speak, they're withholding from the group. Now, something else that's pretty powerful about introverted people, some people say that they tend to be in leadership positions. Why? Well, if you think about leadership is often assessed in young people by the quality of their thinking. Well, how do you assess the quality of somebody's thinking? By the quality of their speaking. And introverts have an edge because they don't speak that often. When they speak, it usually has more impact. If you speak all the time, by definition, your speaking impact will be diminished. There's just less power there if you speak a lot. So there you have it. Introverts add a lot as long as we can get them to speak. I think the last part about that would be, De Bono would say these are the people with the blue hats. These are the people who have the best eye on process. The person who's quiet and reflective most likely knows where the group is in the conversation and what might be the next step. And then in terms of doing this thoughtfully, if you're leading a meeting ahead of time, I would sit down and say, who would you like in each conversation? Who would I like to start this conversation? Who do I want to make sure I check with before we leave the conversation? and who do I want to draw into the conversation? I actually, in my training programs, do an experiment. So I set up the training program saying, you do not have to speak in these sessions, because I want to honor people who are quiet and reflective. I want to put people in the mode where they learn the best. But at some point, I say, I want to run an experiment. For the next hour, I'm going to call on people. And my purpose is, I want you to show you how brilliant you are. And now, if I call on you, you can say, Paul, I don't have anything. But it always turns out that the quiet people who are not speaking have something to say, and it's usually impactful. So we've got to get there. We have to call on people strategically and gently.
That's a great point. So it's interesting as you're sort of talking about this, I'm seeing some other questions coming through from people sort of having to do with meeting overload. How do you, if you're in an organization that meets all the time, how do you push back on that? If you're in a bunch of meetings that really are just briefings and you're sitting there thinking, we didn't really have to get together for this could have been an email. How do you sort of cut down on that in your organization culture? How do you push back on that?
Well, it's very tough unless somebody that counts says, let's do something about this. But any person who's in management says, let's just get to work on this. I don't exactly know how to get there, but we need to get there. Let's have maybe fewer meetings, but for sure, let's get in and get the work done. I think we need to have meeting competency added to the leadership competency list. But it's pretty difficult unless somebody who matters in the organization doesn't say, we've got work to do, we've got to improve, it's a core competency. Now, I think people can always ask for what they want, so as a participant, you have a right to ask for what you need to be effective in a meeting. I think you have a right to say, what part of the meeting do you want me to attend? I think you have a right to say, I've got 4 meetings in these days, I need not to go to one, so which one should I not go to? I think you have a right to ask for clarity, candor, commitment, completion. I think you have a right to ask for more setup. I think you have a right to ask other people to join the conversation. So it's tough unless somebody says, let's change it here, and then as an individual, you can always do your part. But that one perspective that I put in front, that if you call a meeting, you are responsible for the time and talent in the room, and don't do that lightly. Now, I would highlight, I don't think you should meet for information sharing purposes. If you're already meeting and discussing 2 or 3 topics that demand the thinking of the group, and then you want to add 10 minutes for information sharing, perfect. I also don't think project reviews that are 10 minutes long are useful, because if it's only 10 minutes, then there's not enough time to actually think through with the project leader. If this is a project that matters, then I would like that project manager or project leader to take 8 minutes, quick update on the project, and then I would like the leadership team to grill that person for 20 minutes, teach them how to think on their feet in a gentle way, a supportive way, but let's make that project better. Let's ask them questions like, what are you losing sleep over? And I see you've got all these milestones. Which one of these are you in jeopardy on? And what can we do for you? If you are, by definition, I think, if you have 10 minutes on the calendar for something, you are limited to information sharing. And therefore, people just wait it out and they don't engage.
What if you're in a meeting, it's unfolding, it's going off track, the whole thing is sort of a slow-motion train wreck? How do you save a meeting that you're in, but you're not leading? Is there a way to do that respectfully and sort of without stepping on toes?
Well, one of the most powerful ideas in influence is the person who has the most influence is the person who can state the problem without making anybody wrong. And we need that in meetings. We need somebody to say, I don't know how about anybody else, but I'm I'm committed to this group. I'm committed to what we're about, but I'm pretty frustrated right now. I don't know what to do about it, but I do need to say we need to somehow step back and figure out what we're doing and get back on track to talking about it in a powerful way. Now, I don't know anybody and where they work, so there's always a risk. Sometimes you have a manager and you should not have that conversation. But I do think if you're a gifted employee, if you're well respected by management, there comes a little bit more responsibility with you because you might be the person who can say, you know what, we need to do something about our meetings. We're too good a group. We're too important in terms of what we're about, not to being good when we're talking together.
That's great. So it's interesting. I'm seeing a lot of questions coming through about meeting minutes now. I think your, sort of call for more people to go back to this as a way to capture the value of meetings really resonated with people. What are the elements of good meeting summary? How can you use them to help further your agenda?
Yeah. One page out, so if I'm pushing the envelope here, out 1 hour after the meeting is over. So that means you have somebody taking notes, knowing that the product is one page when we leave. Then the elements are topics discussed, key points in each topic, and actions. So it's not that somebody can relive the meeting by reading your minutes, but they get a sense of what was talked about, the key points in each topic, and what actions are going to happen as a result. Now, they could also sit down with somebody who was there, take that set of summary, and get really in touch with the conversation. So think about that as they go for one page, 1 hour afterwards, topics, key points, and commitments.
That's great. So the other thing theme I'm seeing here, we probably only have time for one or two more questions, unfortunately, is a lot about distributed teams and building communication candor, especially on those teams. Do you have are there special tricks or tips you can give for people on virtual teams?
A couple of thoughts come to mind. Put more time at the beginning of the meeting to connect with people. So let's say you have people on 10 different countries. In each meeting, ask 3 of them to catch you up on what's going on in their country. People love to talk about their countries. Ask a couple others to talk about what's going on in their families. So with virtual groups, you need to build in more time at the beginning of the meeting for connection and relating. Every time you are together in the same city, have a dinner meeting. Most countries love that. Americans, we have kind of shifted to, I want to get out of work and get home and be with my family. Except on virtual teams, I just think you owe it to the whole possibility of a team that when anybody from any other place is in town, you go to dinner and do work. Then the other thing is I think you need to increase the visibility and awareness for how you're going to lead the meeting, and particularly let people know you're going to call on them. And if I lead a virtual meeting, I have somebody next to me, and they have a chart of everybody who's on the phone. And they also keep track of every person who speaks, so that I can quickly glance, remember who's out there, and know whether they've been in the conversation yet. Then on some topics, I start with the people in the room. Other topics, I start with people outside the room. Hope that's helpful.
That is wonderful. That's very helpful. Thank you again for talking with us today, Paul. I'm afraid that we're just about out of time. Thank you again.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
Yes. So I want to thank all of you for participating as well. Paul's book is Meetings Matter, and of course, for more on meetings, visit hbr.org. This concludes our presentation for today. Have a great day, everybody.